Hello and welcome back to Crafty Magic Arts. Today we're going to be making something quite unique based on a simple comment my son made. Did you know that sharks are buff? Today we're going to be going and collecting a shark model free from Thingiverse. And then also I'm going to be using this articulated figure which I used previously to create the bird arms in my burbs. And I'm going to be converting the shark from this simple shape into the swol shark. Now this is using the two files, combining them and then modifying the file itself, especially using the sculpting tool. I did not record any of that, but I figured I'd show you what it looked like in Blender. Then I brought it into the lychee slicer and sliced it up so it could be printed on my 3D resin printer. It printed quite smoothly. Took a few tries because it was actually very heavy, which is why the piece itself was hollow, but eventually I did get it to a place where I was able to successfully print it off. It did take a little bit of effort to get all the supports off, but eventually they popped off nicely and I was left with a pretty nice looking piece, ready to go. I did have one break, which I'll fix later, and you can see that on the arm right there. But overall, very pleased. Just got to clean up these pieces. I do keep some of the pieces and actually get them cured just so they can be used for future projects. Here I'm using some wood filler to fill in all the little dimples that were caused by the supports on the head. This is something you do have to deal with sometimes, and it's not that big a deal. Just got to sand it and make it look nice and smooth again. There's additional areas that needed some work. Once that was all done, I needed to actually sculpt the new fin that broke off from the tip of his flipper there, or tip of his arm. Epoxy sculpt, fix that up real quick. And really that's the only epoxy sculpt I needed aside from a few things in the underarms just to have the transitions look a little nicer. Once that was all done, I just had to use some gesso to paint up the piece. Gesso all ready to go. I do have some imperfections, so I decided to sand it, which resulted in this peeling situation. Not a good idea, but I cleaned it up, added more gesso, but unfortunately it was still very, very noticeable, so I do end up using some of my modeling compound here and smoothing it onto the piece, and eventually after it's dry I sand it back up again and it's looking good again. Thank goodness. Don't mind my voice, by the way. I have been sick for the past couple weeks, which has been lots of fun. Here I'm actually preparing for the paint job. It's very simple. I just want to make sure that I'm actually capturing where the colors are supposed to be. So I have my photo reference off to the side, and you can see here this is where I'm going to plan his coloring. I use this gray blue that I mixed up using references to get the color just right, and I paint up the entire back of the shark. I do actually end up painting the arms fully, but I do end up having to add some white there to have a better transition. And this is after doing a little bit more research online to make sure I have the coloring where it needs to be. Turns out photo references for sharks is actually very difficult to get a good color match because the color of the water, the angle of the light changes how they look, but eventually I settled on this kind of color and setup using the references I had. So I do add the white to the arms because underneath their flippers there's white. I'm going for accuracy and realism here, as you can tell. I'm being sarcastic. He's got swole arms. Now doing a little bit of shading, keeping the shark in mind. I do actually end up printing off some references just to make it a little easier on me, trying to get the color as close as possible to what I'm seeing there. I don't bother with any kind of light effects. I just want the shading, like the dark to light coloring. I'm pretty pleased with how it's looking right now, but I do need to add some additional shading, so I go onto my pastels. I use a lot of pastels to get additional transition of color, as well as really highlight some of those areas on the shark's chest. I do give him abs, and I don't want that to be lost. Abs and pecs, because again, he's a swole shark. He's got to have those things. After the pastels carry me as far as I can take them, I do move on to my colored pencils here. They're actually watercolor pencils and they work really well. Again, I'm using them to highlight the areas in which are kind of subdued by just being painted a flat color. You gotta work it. I'm using a dark color here, like the dark blue, because you cannot see those abs unless you actually do something, which is unfortunate. Now, sharks are pretty well known to have like scrapes and scratches. I do add this onto him and highlight them with like a darker color underneath so they're more obvious. This is just to give him a tad of realism. Again, I am going for realism here. Looking to add some detail to his facial features, including his nostrils, as well as a few additional little scratches on his nose. I also go back over the eyes with a little bit more black, however I do actually paint them with paint because even though this is a black pencil, it definitely feels a little too gray. Here I am adding on his gills. I want to make sure he can breathe, it's important. Honestly, there's just a lot of back and forth. I don't actually add all of it in here, but it is there. By the way, if you're wondering, that styrofoam piece that I have there was a godsend while I was making this. I actually made it so I had a place to stand up the shark, but it ended up working really well when I laid him down because I didn't want to damage his dorsal fin. Here I'm adding a little bit of color to his chest. It's actually a tiny bit of tan, again, to just enhance his masculine features, I guess. Being the careful artist that I am, I definitely don't drop the shark and nearly break him. Now this weird hook contraption thing that you can see here is actually being made so I can spray seal my shark. See, works perfectly. I'm mimicking spraying. It's gonna be flawless. And it actually does work. I do flip the shark around so I can get both angles. But yeah, all right, we are finally moving on to the base. Now this piece right here is actually from a turntable that I bought from Value Village eons ago. It was just the centerpiece. It was way too tall, so I sanded it off, and now I need to clean it up. You can see here, he's gonna fit nicely. I needed to actually make my own sand. This is actually some kinetic sand that I painted, but I needed to actually add a little bit more to it, so I'm using some different types of mica powder to kind of make it look like more realistic sand. So I use a variety of different colors here, and it's actually working really well, but baking powder really saved the day here, as it was fine enough to actually appear like real sand. Now here I'm actually going to be adding some resin to it, as I do want it to stay in the piece. Art resin is my resin of choice, as it works quite well, and here I am just mixing the two parts together, or getting the prep to be mixed. One thing I like about this resin is it doesn't have any odor, so I do really like using it, although I still do recommend using a mask when working with resin, as well as any gloves. It's just a good idea overall. Here I'm mixing together. I actually pour it back and forth in the jugs to make sure it's mixed really well, as I want it to stay consistent. Now, I do add way too much resin to this piece. I do regret making it. I was hoping that it'd be more like a putty, but it settled way too well, so I actually have to turn it on its side to get the angle I want. I want the shark to be standing in the sand, but I don't want it to be like in the sand. So I actually see it's poured at an angle, and that's intentional, and I did actually sink some different shells into it. But now, because I poured resin on top, there's actually like a gap, and I need to actually carve that out so the shark has something to stand in. You can see the line there, and after a lot of carving, I have a deep enough groove for my shark to stand in. Using my UV resin, I do place the shark into that groove and then cure it into the piece. It does stand very well here, which I really like, and ends up working really well. Not done yet though. I do need to cover up the shark's fins, so I do actually add up just clear resin to make it look like water all the way to the surface. Now, while it's still wet, I do want to add a little more to it, so I do reach into my collection and I find actually an old piece of driftwood. I believe I used this driftwood on my Big Hat Logan piece, so I'm using up a piece of it again, and here I'm adding some rocks that I picked up from the dollar store. This is just a nice container of rocks. They're quite smooth and they look great. Now, finally adding the color to his eyes using paint, and then I decide to add a tiny bit of white using the very tip of my very sharp tweezers to get that tiny little dot in his eyes. Now that that's all done, I do want to cover him in a glossy Mod Podge to make sure that he looks like he's shiny from the ocean, like he just came out, kind of glistening. But I do want ripples in the water, so I use this silicone. This does work quite well, although I do find the silicone to be quite tacky, I use some cornstarch to help with the tackiness, but I do actually end up covering it in Mod Podge to help like relieve the tackiness. But that's after I'm done working on these shells. Now, I showed at the beginning, it was very quick, where there's actually a crack on the side. I also dripped some resin. So I just end up kind of hiding those imperfections using more sticks, more shells, more rocks, and I stick them to the base. It's not meant to be perfect, it's just meant to cover up the issues. Here I'm covering the silicone with some gloss Mod Podge just to help with the tackiness that I'm finding with the silicone. And then now, to make sure that none of the pieces move, I am adding a little bit more of the UV resin to really lock them in place. The hot glue's not going to last, especially just against plastic, so I lock them in place using resin. And it's looking quite lovely. I do like what the shells add to the piece, and I have my wonderful shark standing above water. Now here, I'm just quickly dry brushing on top of the silicone to make it look like the waves are crashing. It was not necessary, but I do like it. Taking a closer look here, you can see all the different twigs, all the different pieces, the shells, all added nicely with him standing wonderfully in the water, so it's done! Yay! And here he is in all his glory. He is standing tall and strong and buff, just like it was always intended. This is literally just a funny joke my son made in the car. I actually don't think it was intended to be a joke, but it sure made me lol. So he told me that sharks are buff, and of course I imagined this, and that's what I made. Overall, the project's a little different because I did just 3D print it, but at the same time, it did take a lot of sculpting in Blender, which took a lot of effort. You just don't get to see me work through it, which is a little different. Maybe next time I'll actually do some screen recording and capture it for you guys. So I hope you enjoyed this. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Be sure to ring the bell notification and stay tuned for the next one. It's gonna be a doozy, I can already assure you that. Thanks, bye.